All right, that looks like it is up and running. We'll give it just another minute for people to finish logging in. It's the trouble with technology is it takes longer for someone to log in than just to walk through the door of a classroom. But we will get there. Any minute now. I know people aren't used to starting on time, but I do like to get going as close to the time scheduled as possible, partly to make sure that just in case we get caught up in longer conversations, we have as much time as possible to study, but also as a proper respect to those that have come on time and not unnecessarily coddling those that routinely show up late. So, since it's recorded, people can always come whenever they arrive, and I don't have to feel too bad. They can always go back and watch the beginning again. So let's go ahead and get started. We are in Teitzei in the book of Deuteronomy. We are coming into the home stretch of the Torah, and in some ways, it feels like Moses is just really throwing the kitchen sink. He is trying to give as many different mitzvot in some, the first time we've heard them, some in more detail than we've heard them, some with a slightly different spin than we've heard them. It's like he's in his home stretch. He's got to get everything out before he has to pass on. And that can make it difficult to know where to begin when studying these. Of course, we can just go through them chronologically, mitzvah after mitzvah. But sometimes we have to make sure that we jump around a bit to touch on different mitzvot that are not found at the beginning of the Torah portion, as many people do tend to peter out a bit as they go through their studies. So we're going to pick up in chapter 24 today, near the last third of the book of, not the book, but the parasha of Teitzei. And we're going to be beginning with verse number 10, with a very important section of Torah, dealing with many of the money issues and the worker issues that are at the heart of Jewish law. For those of you that were there for my sermon or saw it on live stream last Shabbat, I was trying to make the point that Torah really does infect everything in life, that it is a full universal way of looking at life, and that absolutely includes our business dealings, as we're going to see in great detail today. So let's go ahead and get started with the actual Torah, and then we will pull out some parts to examine in more depth. Chapter 24, verse 10. When you lend to your neighbor a loan of anything, you are not to enter his house to take his pledge as a pledge. Outside you are to stand, and the man to whom you have lent it is to bring out the pledge to you outside. We'll get on to the next detail of this, but just to make sure you understand, because the language here in Fox mimics the Hebrew enough to make it slightly confusing, which is why I like Everett Fox's translation. It forces you to think a little bit more carefully. If it's the pledge, then why would I not be allowed to take his pledge? I mean, it's mine as pledge. And the idea here is, of course, the underlying dignity of a person, even if they are in a position, or maybe especially when they are in a position where they have to take out a loan and where they are securing it with some object as part of the pledge for repayment, that if it is in their house, you must still treat it as being a special place for them, a dignified place, rather than just barging in and saying, oh, well, since I've given you a loan and you owe me the pledge, I'll just go in and take it. You have to allow them to go back into their house to get the pledge and bring it out to you. Obviously, if they choose not to, then that's a violation of the terms of a loan. And then, of course, the court can always step in. But here we are dealing with the initial establishment of the loan. And even though the person giving the loan has a right to the pledge, they don't have a right to just take it. That is still protected and allows the person who needs the loan more dignity. As I've mentioned previously, most of the loans that we are looking at throughout the Torah and really throughout the rest of Tanakh, and even a large portion of what's found in rabbinic literature, are poverty loans. A person is in need of money, whether it be to buy seed, to replace an animal that just died, to finish repairing the plow, whatever it might be. They don't have enough of their own assets to be able to continue, and they take out a loan in order to tide them over, which they will then pay back without interest when they are in a better situation. But of course, the people making the loans were not usually swarming with money. These were not big banks. These weren't, God forbid, payday loan places. These were other people in the community who didn't have the money to make a gift of what they were doing, but could offer a loan. And in the process of offering a loan, they would take a security, collateral, if you will, as a pledge for its eventual return. So that's why we're in this situation. But even though this person is in desperate need, that doesn't mean that they have to sacrifice their dignity, their self-respect. Let's pick up on verse 12 as we get into an even more edge case. And if he is an afflicted man, you may not lie down in his pledge. You are to return, yes, return to him his pledge, the pledge when the sun comes in, that he may lie down in his garment and bless you, and yours will be righteous merit before the presence of Adonai, your God. So here, if a person is especially poor, then they will only have their outer garment as their other object, that they own nothing except literally the clothes they are standing in. And at this time, the outer wrapped garment was also their blanket. And so if you were to take that as a pledge, fine, but at night, you would need to give it back. Yes, technically it is yours to hold on to until the loan has been collected, but if you are to hold on to this as his pledge, as the pledge overnight, then what would this poor person be using as a blanket, as a covering for their sleep? No, at night you have to return the pledge. You can get it back in the morning before whatever else happens in the day, but at night it has to be returned. And here the Torah is explicit that you are doing so because in the process of returning it, of showing this level of compassion and understanding to a person that is in the most desperate state of need, that this person will in turn also be thankful for your actions. They will offer prayers and blessings on your behalf, and this will be good for you as well as good for them, which ultimately is the whole point of all of this, that when we are doing what is righteous, tzedakah is the term that's used in this verse as well as many others, that it is a benefit to us and our community. So this is a small slice of life in this loan process. Before we go into verse 14, which is a slightly different topic, any questions about the loans and the pledges? This is not going to be our main focus, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk about it at least a little. Not seeing anyone on YouTube chatting, not seeing anyone in Zoom unmuting. So let's go ahead and move on to verse 14. You are not to withhold from a hired hand, an afflicted and needy one, whether from your brothers or from your sojourner that is within your land, within your gates. On his payday, you are to give his wage. You are not to let the sun come in upon him. For he is afflicted, for it lifts his life's breath, that he not call out against you to Adonai, and there be sin upon you. All right, these two little verses are actually telling us an awful lot. So first of all, the basic principle seems to be, and we're going to go into this in more detail, that you have an obligation to pay somebody at the time that they are supposed to be paid. A little bit of a history here. We have in the ancient world, still in today's world as well, although it's less common, many people who didn't have a farm of their own to work, didn't have a trade, a shop of their own to work in. So they would hire themselves out, often on a day-by-day basis. So the person goes and says, hey, do you need any help with the sheep shearing? And you say, sure, you can help me shear the sheep and I'll pay you X amount at the end of the day. Well, he helps you during the day. The day is now done. He comes to you and says, okay, I need my wages now. And you say, I'll tell him tomorrow. I'll pay you tomorrow. That is the problem we're talking about. That if you have hired a person and they have done the work, that you are obligated to pay them before the sun goes down. We're going to go into much more detail about some of the other layers of this law, that it's not only about day laborers, but let's make sure we have that basic principle down. If you hire someone, they do the work, you have a mitzvah obligation to pay them at the time that they finish the work before the sun goes down. Now, again, we're talking here not even waiting till the next day from when they were supposed to be paid. That very day, you are obligated to pay. And notice that unlike many other mitzvot within the Torah, we get a bit more of an explanation. I know this is 2 in a row that we get that, but as you can see down here at the bottom, that this is an issue of his life. The phrase, it literally says, right, that hu noseh et nafsho, that the wages that are given, the salary that is his, literally lifts up his nefesh, his spirit, his soul. Here, Fox translating life breath, because nefesh can mean is connected to the idea of breathing. So apparently paying someone in a timely manner has a life or death consequence. More about that in our commentary. And that is what we need to bear in mind when we are considering whether or not to withhold his wages after the appointed time. And here, unlike the issue of the pledge, where when it is returned, the person will bless you, here, if you withhold the pledge to if you withhold the wages to the worker, then that person will call out against you. And rather than it being tzedakah, rather than it being righteous merit, it will be a chet, it will be a sin that you have made against him. And God will note this transgression against you and the worker. Questions or comments on 14 or 15? We will be spending a lot more time on this, but just because we're in the area, I've got to finish off chapter 24 because there's too many good mitzvot to miss here. All right, so let's go ahead and finish up chapter 24, and then we will take a look at 14, 15 in more depth. Fathers are not to be put to death for sons, and sons are not to be put to death for fathers. Everyone for his own sin alone is to be put to death. We're not only talking about death here, but the principle is one that is more general and striking in the ancient world, and really all the way up until the pre-modern world, where if a person commits a transgression, that person is responsible for the transgression, and the punishment should not be given to the other members of that person's family. Even though in the ancient world, children were considered to be extensions of the parents, that didn't mean that they were legally extensions to the point of punishment. Likewise, parents could not be punished for their children. Yes, the Torah does talk also about the visiting of iniquities upon the next generation, but that is a different concept than a court punishing somebody. In the other sections of the Torah, which talks about the transmission of transgression, it is really talking about the idea that the transgressions that are committed will have a continuing, ongoing, deleterious effect upon the children, the grandchildren, and further. That one person committing a crime will impact much more than just themselves in the commission of that crime. It is not talking about the court punishing people, nor is it treating those people as actual sinners, but they will be unfortunate victims of the transgressions of a person. Verse 17, we continue. You are not to cast aside the case of a sojourner or an orphan. You are not to seize for payment the clothing of a widow, meaning that there are special protections put in place for the ger, which is usually translated here as a foreigner that lives among you, the resident alien, if you will. It later comes to also mean those that have converted. But here it really seems to be talking more about a resident non-Jew or the orphan who has no parents to advocate on his behalf, as well as a widow who often is lacking other advocates of equal power within society. You are to bear in mind that serf were you, meaning you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to observe this word or this matter. So God again is putting a bit more of an explanation here. This is the sort of third that we've had in the set that we've been looking at. You make sure to give back the pledge so they will bless you. You make sure to give the wages so they don't curse you and count it as a sin. And you take care of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, because you know what it is like to be at the lowest rung of society. For after all, you were even lower than that when you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And to finish off that concept, when you cut down your harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf in the field, you are not to return to get it. For the sojourner, for the orphan, and for the widow it shall be, in order that Adonai your God may bless you in all your doings of your hands. When you knock off your olives, you are not to check the boughs after you. For the sojourner, for the orphan, and for the widow it shall be. When you cut off grapes in your vineyard, you are not to glean after you. For the sojourner, for the orphan, and for the widow it shall be. You are to bear in mind that serf were you in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. So the idea is throughout all of this, that as we know what it is like to be at the bottom of the economic world, we are to make sure that we are leaving enough from the extra of what we produce so that others who do not have the similar blessing are able to support themselves. You'll note this is not means tested. This is not if you are rich enough, leave the gleanings behind, or if you are rich enough, leave your vineyards behind, if leave the extras of the vineyard behind. This is if you are able to have a field, if you are able to have an orchard, if you're able to have a vineyard, then you are already in a position where this mitzvah becomes your obligation. And that is part of binding the community together and providing the necessary vehicle for supporting all of those who are not in possession of these sorts of resources. All right, any questions or comments before we go to our commentary? All right, then let's dive in. We're going to begin with Mishnah Torah from Rambam as we get some of the nitty-gritty of how we must pay our workers. And as you'll see, based upon the teachings of the Chachamim, of the sages in the Mishnah and Talmud, there's more detail needed. And indeed, this is just a small selection. So obviously, studying more would be a good idea. It is a positive command, that is to say, it is a mitzvah of thou shalt do something, to pay the hired man his wages on time. As it is written, you must pay him his wages on the same day, from the verse that we studied. If the employer delayed the payment till after it was due, he has transgressed a prohibitive command. As it is written, let not the sun go down upon it. So Rambam is saying that there are two commandments. One, pay in the timely manner, and two, don't hold on to it when you should have paid it. Obviously, if you do the first one, you're not in violation of the second one. And if you fail to do the first, you will automatically be in violation of the second. The transgressor is not to be lashed for this, since he is required to pay money. So what they're trying to say here is not that there isn't a punishment, but that the punishment is not the usual punishment for a rebelliousness of a prohibitive command that doesn't have another penalty specified, but it is trying to remind us that the punishment for this is to actually make the person pay, that is the ultimate goal. The just flogging the transgressor but allowing him to keep the money, for example, would not be the appropriate punishment. One must pay on time not only the hire of a human being, but also the hire of an animal and the hire of implements. If one put off the payment, he has transgressed a prohibitive command. So the rabbis understood that the payment for hire was not only for when you hired a person, but if you hired someone else's donkey to carry a load or ox to use your plow, or if you hired the plow itself, that the payment for those as well needed to be paid at the appropriate time. And anyone who detains the wages of a hired man is as if he took his life. As it is written, his life depends upon it. As we said, his soul is lifted by this. That Rambam is giving just a little bit of a glimpse of the motivation behind this, that we should look at this problem as seriously as we would look upon problems of assault, battery, or murder. That if a person is withholding the wages of a worker, that you are jeopardizing that person's life. Now, when are wages due? A hireling for the day collects his wages. A hireling for the day collects his wages all night. And about him it is written, you shall not detain overnight the wages of your day laborer until morning. A hireling for the night collects all day. And about him it is written, you must pay him his wages on the same day. A hireling by the hour during the day collects all day. A hireling by the hour during the night collects all night. Hiring by the week, by the month, by the year, by a 7-year period, collects all day if his term ends in the daytime. If his term ends in the night, he collects all that night. So what Rambam is trying to explain in more detail here, based upon the teachings of our sages as they analyzed these verses together with Leviticus 19, is that the period of employment will determine the payment. And this is essentially saying that if a person wants to hire themselves out for just an hour, then they get paid that day. They want to get hired for the night, then they have the following day to be paid on, that it is the period immediately after the work has concluded. Likewise, if you're getting paid by the week, by the month, by the year, then there is also a payday, and that payday is fixed. Even though they may have worked 365 days, if you said you're going to pay them on day 366, then that is the day they must be paid on. You can't say come back on day 367 or 368. You have to pay them at the appropriate time. And this concept, as Rambam began this paragraph, is entirely about this is somebody's life, that you have taken their labor in exchange for payment. That payment was essential for them for their life, and by delaying the payment, you are essentially jeopardizing their life. For surely they designed their life with the idea of their payment coming at a timely manner. Questions or comments on that very brief overview from Rambam? All right. From Sefer HaMitzvot, we get a slightly more in-depth understanding of what's really going on here. Robbery is the taking of something that is with another by force, duress, and fighting, like the robbers in the cities do. And we are prohibited by this from this action by God saying, "You shall not rob." Very straightforward. We all understand finding someone in a dark alley and pointing a gun at them and saying, "Give me your wallet," that is prohibited. Very straightforward. Whereas exploitation is that someone else has something of value, meaning money that is coming to him, that one is holding and not giving to him, either by force or not by force, but always through deception. However, the example of what does this exploitation look like is that of a wage worker, because it is a full obligation upon you, even though he did not give you money from himself, and money did not come to you from him. Nevertheless, since he came to you with a well-known obligatory arrangement, you are obligated. And the one who transgresses exploitation has the same law as a robber. This is from his saying, now in Leviticus 5, and denies to his kinsman a deposit or a pledge or robbery or exploitation from his countrymen. By putting these together, it is trying to tell us that morally we should feel an equivalence between all of these things. Now, unfortunately, I think all of you will recognize that many people will treat the alley robbery as being a very different type of crime from the deception, exploitation of somebody to whom you owe their wages. And that is what Sefer HaMitzvot is trying to correct within our our moral sensibilities. That while we may recoil from the threat or use of violence that is found within robbery, we should also recoil from the deception or the power the power imbalance that allows exploitation in a white collar setting. That to withhold the check of somebody who has done work for you is the equivalent of taking that from them, because the wages do belong to them at that point. And by not giving them what is theirs, you are essentially robbing them. And that should be felt morally as being equivalent. And that's where he's trying to explain here in the middle, that even though he didn't give you the money in the typical robbery in the alleyway kind of giving you their wallet, nevertheless, the money that is with you belongs to him. And thus it came into your possession now after the due date that it should have been given to him, through deceit or through force, and in a way that is akin to robbery. You are holding on to stolen property. Once their term of service was due, once their salary was due, once their pay was owed to them, the money, even though it had been yours up until that moment, now that you have delayed past the time the Torah gave, you are essentially holding on to stolen property, and you are guilty of that theft. Does everybody understand the underlying logic there of how it can be that holding on to someone's wages can be so similar to taking something forcefully from someone else in a more classic robbery setting? I guess they do, because I'm not seeing any unmutes and no texts in our YouTube chat box. Okay, so we're now moving into the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, which is one of the great works of Musar, trying to guide our moral development, not only our halachic observance, but also the way that our soul feels about the mitzvot, in order that we will benefit from the performance of the mitzvot properly, meaning spiritually, but also so that we will be more committed and stronger in our observance of the commandments. The reason one is not allowed to delay paying wages till the morning following is that God arranges sustenance for each of his creatures, and the laborer in question was allocated these wages by God to use them for his food supply this very day. So he is getting us right back into that very acute setting that the Torah seems to be describing, where a day laborer has worked for the day and now expects their wages. And he's explaining that this whole arrangement was put in place by God. The person needed to eat, so they were able to find this job, and that job would give them their pay, and that pay would allow them to buy food. That this is the way God has arranged for this person to be taken care of, for this person to eat, just as he has arranged for you to get the benefit of the labor for whatever productive purpose they are being used for. So this is part of the way God has arranged for people to be taken care of and be able to provide for themselves. By denying him access to this, meaning to the pay, which denies him his access to a food supply, the employer effectively interfered with God's decree, and the angel appointed to oversee allocation of sustenance on that day will turn into an accuser against the employer in question. So Shnei Luchot HaBrit is heavily influenced by many mystical traditions, and he is trying to rally those traditions in support of this mitzvah of paying timely, and of making sure that we view it with all of the strength that we should, as being such a serious commandment. That if God has allocated that an angel will make sure that each person is looked after correctly, and that angel then has to go back to God, and when God says, did everybody get what they were supposed to get, and say, well, no, Mr. Shapiro did not get what he was supposed to get, because Mr. Cohen didn't pay him the way he was supposed to. So Mr. Shapiro did not eat today because he didn't get his wages. That is what it means by turning him into an accuser. That is, in general, what Judaism means by the whole Satan concept within Judaism, where there is a figure that will accuse us, that will stand before God and say, this person has messed up and you ought to throw the book at them. Indeed, he will be judged as having transgressed a royal decree. The domain which will judge the employer is the attribute of night. I don't want to go into Shnei Luchot HaBrit's Kabbalistic teachings, but basically this is the strictest form of justice, meaning no mercy, no compassion. God is going to hold the employer to an extremely high standard and will absolutely account against them in the harshest way possible, commensurate to the crime that they have committed. So again, from both the early days through the Middle Ages and in now into more recent times, we can see that our tradition takes exceedingly seriously this issue of abusing a worker by withholding their correct pay. Questions or comments before we move into our next commentary? All right, so on to Sefer HaChinuch, another great text from the Middle Ages, and which I hope will give us also some more of the underlying emotion behind this. Just as a quick aside, because sometimes people, I think, don't always pick up on this. Yes, we are following the commandment because it is a commandment. God said pay in a timely manner and don't withhold the pay. So of course we should pay in a timely manner and not withhold the pay. Great, fine, perfect. Why are our commentaries then so focused on not only explaining the details, such as Rambam, but also the emotional justification and the spiritual understanding for why this commandment is so important? After all, we don't always see this in the case of every other commandment. And usually where this crops up is where this has become a recurring issue. And indeed, we know that the timely payment of a worker is something that is often overlooked in the course of doing business. That the employer may not view this as seriously as they view other types of issues. They could be very careful about tithing. They could be very careful about the laws of how they are planting their crops. They could be very careful about every other aspect of Jewish law. But when it comes time to pay, there is a very real tendency for employers to not always feel as eager to fulfill this command as they did the other commands involved, even in this same act of production. And as such, our tradition has had to repeat in multiple times and in multiple ways the justifications and the spiritual exhortation for why we must treat this as being an extremely serious transgression and one which needs to be avoided. This goes in a similar fashion to when we talk about many of the verbal crimes that people will commit, that people often don't take them seriously. As such, you will find a disproportionate amount of commentary trying to convince people that indeed this needs to be upheld. Now, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, the person who here has been wronged by this employer, they can always go to the court and they can get satisfaction through the Beit Din system. And yes, that is true. The courts are there to fix problems like this. But our sages, the sages of the early days as well as later, they don't want it to have to go to the court. This isn't about getting the employer to pay up eventually. This is about getting the employer to fulfill the commandment in advance, actually at the correct time, and to avoid the delay, which, as you can see, all of our commentaries believe it would be a terrible problem for the employee. That yes, there might be eventual legal redress, but that delay is a problem for that person. Even if eventually they get their money, the time that they have to wait or waste, perhaps even still, in the court is problematic and just something that should be avoided, but it can only be avoided if the employer is properly motivated, hence the long discussions. So What does Sefer HaChinuch say about this? It is from the roots of the commandment that it is because God, blessed be he, desires the preservation of man, meaning a human, which he created. And it is well known that with the delay of nourishment, the body will be destroyed. Like Shnei Luchot HaBrit, he is saying that this is really about supporting the individual's body. And therefore, we are commanded to give the wages of the wage earner as he urgently depends upon it. This translation for the soul resting upon it, to sustain himself from it. And it appears that therefore did he place the limit of its time to be 1 day and not more, as it is the way of people to sometimes fast for a day. There are days when people fast either willingly or unwillingly, but they expect to eat at the end of the day with the wages that they earn. And therefore, they may be exceedingly hungry by the time they finish their term of employment. And if you delay till the next day, then you are pushing them from just fasting for a few meals into a much longer period of starvation. And explicitly did the verse give a reason for the thing, in it stating, he urgently depends upon it. His soul is resting upon it, lifted by it. And even though they, may their memory be blessed, expounded it for different matter, its simple understanding implies that which we wrote. Meaning, even though the sages will go on to talk about this in many different other spiritual ideas, we can't lose sight of the fact that when somebody is expecting their pay, they are physically harmed when they do not receive it. And while it may be true in the modern world that many people are not living literally day by day for the salary that they make each day, it is absolutely the case that a person may need to live paycheck by paycheck and risk losing their home, risk losing the ability to pay their utilities or their grocery or medical bills in a way that will harm them physically. On top of that, those that are not paid in a timely manner may have additional stress because of it, as would be obvious. And that, of course, it creates physical ailment as well. Stress is one of the most corrosive forces to act upon a human body, and one of the ones that we should be able to erase by simply living the life we are supposed to and following these commandments. And all the time that he delays, the employer delays his payment, even after the time, he transgresses a negative commandment from the rabbis, may their memory be blessed, and they based it on the verse that is written, do not say to your fellow, go and come back, taken from Proverbs. So they're trying to say that it's not just you committed a transgression the day you forgot or refused to pay. Every moment that you continue to delay continues to be a transgression. The transgression is not one and done. I missed that moment, so now what difference does it make? By continuing to delay, you are expanding and extending the transgression. And likewise, the moment you pay, you can stop that transgression and repair it. And they, may their memory be blessed, said, this time in Bava Metzia and the Talmud, about one who suppresses the wage of a wage worker, that he transgresses on account of do not oppress, do not rob, and do not lay over, and on account of the sun should not set upon it, meaning that there are multiple transgressions involved in the withholding of a salary. And they said about a resident alien, meaning somebody that wasn't Jewish, on its day you shall give his wage, applies to him, but we do not transgress, do not lay over with him. And this law of the resident alien is explicit in the Mishnah in the chapter Hamikabel, and Rambam, may his memory be blessed, wrote that the law is the same with any Noachad. So these laws in a form are also expanded beyond the borders of the Jewish community as well. And I would like to finish with a selection here taken from the 19 letters. If you haven't read Rabbi Samuel Raphael Hirsch's 19 letters written during the 1800s, wrestling with the idea of modernity and trying to explain Judaism to a modern mind, I highly recommend it. This particular translation is not the best that I've seen, but it was the one most readily available to share. So I'll try to expand upon the slightly clunky English to give you more of an understanding. But it is not a long composition, and it is an extremely worthwhile book. So here he is talking in the section titled Mishpatim about judgments or principles of justice. And he is contrasting these with things like chukim, the various edicts that God has given that don't seem to be specifically about justice, or Tohorot, the instructions that we are given that are more of the higher levels of conceptualizing the world. Here, Mishpatim, we are talking about what we might call just rules of justice. All these ideal theories have only value, however, if you really live as you have gained the conception in a divine world with divine powers, man Israel. So man Israel is the term that he is using for the person that he is addressing. But what he is trying to say in this first verse is that if you are going to take Torah to heart, if you're going to take the idea of God to heart, if you're going to live in that mindset, then we have to actually put this into practice. You have to really live according to that. And the first requisite of living that way is justice. Respect every being around you and all that is in you as the creation of your God. Everything belonging to them as given them by God or in accordance with law which he has sanctioned. So very much in keeping with the theme of the Enlightenment from which he was part of, and partly responding to and also partly ratifying, Rabbi Hirsch here is trying to say that we owe justice to everyone because God ordained it, but emotionally, conceptually, because we are called upon to respect that all that I am, all that the other person is, all that they have or I have is what God has allowed to be in creation. And as such, my obligation to them to act according to the rules of justice is rooted in this notion of a shared creator and of a shared understanding that what each of us owns rightfully belongs to us only because of God's rules of justice, whether it be that I received initially or that I have received correctly through the proper application of a just society. Leave willingly to each being that which it is justly entitled to call its own. A very fancy way of saying don't covet or be jealous, and don't exploit or steal from someone else, but do so, try to cultivate in your mind an emotional peace with that. Yes, that person is entitled to their salary, and even though I would love to get richer by not giving it to them, I shouldn't think that way. I should rebuke that part of myself that says, I bet if you kept it for a few more days, you could invest it and make a little extra off of it and then pay them. And then, what's the big harm? No. If it belongs to him, give it to him willingly. Allow yourself to not begrudge giving to somebody what is theirs. Be not as regards anything accursed. Don't take this as being, woe is me, I have to follow the rules. Instead, you should be happy and at peace with these acts of justice. Especially honor every human being as your equal. Regard him in his essence, that is to say, in his invisible personality, in his bodily envelope, and in his life. Meaning, think of each person as being their own person, not an object to be exploited, not something to be dominated, not something to be taken advantage of. They are perfect and intact in and of themselves, and we should respect and honor that person as a person first and foremost, and as our equal. Extend the same regard to his artificially enlarged body, which is a really clunky phrase for his property, meaning treat what belongs to another person as an extension of the person, just as you would not cut off someone's finger, nor should you take their property. To the demands which he may be entitled to make upon you for assistance by grants of property or by acts of physical strength, in measure and number, in recompense of injury to his person or possessions. Again, fancy language for saying, if you break something of his, you owe him the proper payment for the damages. That is an obligation and something you should not begrudge and something you should willingly give because you honor him, and you honor him as an equal, and you honor him as a creation of God. Have regard also to his rightful claim of truth, of liberty, of happiness and peace of mind, of honor and undisturbed tranquility. Do not abuse his weakness of heart, mind, or body. Do not unjustly employ your legal power over him. So there are many circumstances where you see the opportunity to take advantage of someone else. They are perhaps naive. They are perhaps unable to resist. In all of those cases, you then must be the one to resist. You must be the one to avoid abusing your position and taking advantage of someone else. They are equal in the eyes of God as you. What gives you the right to violate them, their body, their property, and take more for yourself? Be happy with what God has given you and respect what God has given others, and allow them to enjoy their share even while you enjoy yours. And if that balance were able to be extended in all aspects of our life, especially in the actions here of workers and employers, as we're finding in this section of Deuteronomy, then indeed we would all be much better off. Any final questions or comments?
Looking at the verses 10 through 15, which we focused on today, the loans and the wages, they have a common thread. It's an economic thread of getting liquidity, money, liquidity into the hands of those who need it most. One of the great stories of the Great Depression in the United States was how liquidity froze. Money wasn't flowing down. It was not trickling down to those who needed it most. And when that happens in various economic systems, social disorder, neighbors hating neighbors, it creates a lot of destroys social cohesion. But there's this idea of in economics that a rising tide lifts all boats. You need to get money into the hands of people who need it most. So therefore we have paying wages in a timely fashion, making loans to those who really normally wouldn't be getting loans. But in all of these cases, we're getting money into the hands of the folks who really need it. Especially in the economic model we have, which is one that is explicitly unequal, with firstborn getting more, some having more and others having less. This is a way of just making sure that liquidity keeps flowing to where it needs to go. And so there's a geniusness in this economic insight that I just find it fascinating.
I mean, from a macro level, I agree. We're looking at it mostly today from the micro level of the individual and what happens to them, both the employee, but also the employer when this system breaks down. But you are absolutely right that from a macro level, the society as a whole begins to break down if we do not keep these principles in operation. However, as you'll notice, most of our tradition has not focused on using the macro argument as a justification or motivation for the observance of this, because we know historically that even if you can get everybody to agree that if you don't pay workers that it's going to be a big problem, that does not stop the individual employer from thinking they can get away with it without triggering the societal level problems. That sure, in theory, they agree that if nobody paid their workers, it would all be a horrible problem and, absolute nightmare. But I can avoid doing it. And as long as everyone else goes along with the mitzvah, everything's fine. But of course, the problem is each person will make that same determination, and the cumulative effect will be the macro level nightmare. But our sages recognize that trying to persuade someone to do something for the good of everyone, when especially what they're doing here is already a very selfish act, is unlikely to be a compelling argument for the selfish kind of person who would refuse to pay in the first place. And so they focus more on the individual and motivation of what you need to do for your reasons, for your soul, for your position in God's world, in order to try and chip away at the selfish ideology that allows a person to transgress this commandment in the first place. All right. I guess we are done for today. I will see everybody again either tonight for Mishnah as we continue with Yadayim, our washing of the hands, or at services for Shabbat, Minyan on Sunday, or next Wednesday for our Torah class. Take care.